Chapter 2: Long-term player contracts are demolishing teams' winning potential. What are long-term contracts in sports? Long-term contracts are between professional players and sports teams, where players agree to offer their services ahead of time for several years, and the teams agree to pay them a salary over the course of those several years. Usually the player's salary increases steadily throughout the contract, and teams agree to this format for two different reasons. The first is that younger players generally get better with age, allowing them to earn more money from the team as the salaries of older players slowly come off the books. The second is that teams typically generate more revenue year over year, allowing them to operate with similar or more favorable margins throughout the contract's life. Long-term contracts are very important in professional sports because they allow teams to show faith they have in free agents and current players, mainly the financial commitment they're willing to make, and because they provide teams' general managers with stability, mainly the opportunity for roster planning. As we've seen throughout sports history, long-term player contracts are high risk, which is why different leagues have their own standard models. In the NFL, long-term contracts are not all that common, and they are generally for a length of 3 or 4 years. In the NBA, long-term contracts are much more common, and generally for a length of 3 or 4, perhaps 5 years. In the MLB, long-term contracts are incredibly common, ranging from as little as 4 years to as many as 7 or even 9 years. Very recently, MLB teams have even agreed to 10, 12, 13, and 14-year contracts with the game's brightest stars. Bidding wars for top talent in free agency have gotten so intense that teams need to outcommit one another in terms of annual salary, but mainly in terms of years. After seeing how massive payrolls are, it should come as no surprise that the big market teams are frequently dishing out contract offers to stars worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Why do teams agree to such massive long-term commitments? The responsibility of assembling major league clubs falls on the shoulders of team general managers. Understandably, these GMs agree to huge commitments because they want to save their own jobs, working in a role with much turnover and little security in the last 2 decades. In the short term, the way to save your job as an MLB GM is to land stars in free agency, and the current model for doing so are agreeing to those massive long-term contracts. Why is signing stars the way to save your job, you may ask? It is because stars carry a greater likelihood of winning, which MLB fans crave from their teams and most MLB owners desire from their GMs. Winning, to no surprise, sells, as World Series champions from 2011 to 2019 averaged a 16% revenue growth in the year they won the title. Even the idea of winning sells, as the Minnesota Twins realized this past March when they sold over 100,000 single-game tickets shortly after the signing of Carlos Correa, a superstar free agent and two-time World Series participant. And just because the idea of winning sells, owners agree to pay players massive long-term contracts. Often the results of this increasingly popular phenomenon are downfalls of team performance and a very, very bad return on investment. Here are some of the most troubling examples. Key: red means the team reached the wild card game or series in that year. Orange is the league division series. Yellow, the league championship series. Light green or lime green means the team reached the World Series. And Kelly green or dark green meant the team actually won the World Series. Purple indicates the player was traded during that season, and blue indicates the player was retired for that or those seasons. Jacoby Ellsbury. Ellsbury hit just .264 and averaged only 26 stolen bases per season, But despite this long-term contract's poor payoff, the Yankees did have great success during the period. This particular franchise was able to overcome their mistake thanks to their big market, heavy revenues, and sky-high payroll. Notably, Ellsbury didn't play a single game for the Yankees during years 5 through 7 due to injury. Jason Heyward. Heyward has hit a mediocre .247 and averaged only 10 home runs in 116 games per season. And despite this long-term contract's really poor payoff, the Cubs have had great success during the period. They won the 2016 World Series, the first year into Heyward's deal, and made the playoffs 3 of the next 4 seasons. However, the World Series championship was won largely because of the team's other stars, who the Cubs were forced to trade away recently because of Heyward's horrible contract. Currently, the Cubs are in another rebuild and falling fast in the standings. Albert Pujols. Pujols had a historic collapse after leaving St. Louis for Los Angeles at age 32, hitting just .256 and averaging only 22 home runs over the course of the 10-year deal. The team only has one playoff berth to show for it, a wild card series in which they were swept 3-0. The Angels still have a winning record in this time, thanks to stars Mike Trout and Shohei Ohtani. However, the massive Pujols contract effectively wasted the early years of Trout and Ohtani's careers, the reason why 2 GMs were fired during the period, and the reason why the Angels released him before his deal even expired. Robinson Cano. Cano didn't play as well as he did with the Yankees, but still hit .296 and averaged 32 doubles per season with the Mariners. The problem is Cano didn't improve the team as much as they hoped when they signed him to a massive deal, so Seattle had to package one of their best young prospects just to trade and get off his huge contract. He contributed to the Mets' success in 2019 and had a huge revival in the shortened 2020 season, but it was revealed he was taking performance-enhancing drugs and he was suspended for the 2021 campaign. He was also suspended 80 games during his final season with the Mariners, the year the team finally broke through. The Cano contract led to 0 playoff berths, a GM being fired, a trade, another rebuild, and even an ownership sale. Currently, the Mets are paying the final 2 years of his contract, even though they released him and he's since signed with the Padres, to which, by the time of this video, he was released as well. David Wright. Wright was a Hall of Fame caliber player in his 20s, but injuries forced his career to spiral right after he signed a massive extension, as he averaged just 80 games and 10 home runs over the course of his last 4 full seasons. The Mets did break through for a World Series run during the third year of his new deal. However, Wright had very little to do with it, as he only played 38 games. He had little to do with their playoff berth the following year as well, playing only 37 games. He missed the entire 2017 campaign and only managed a 2-game farewell visit during the 2018 campaign. Despite not playing, he significantly limited the Mets' ability to sign replacement players due to his large contract. The team hasn't won a single playoff game since 2015. They fired 2 GMs over the course of the deal, and their owners actually put the team up for sale during the course of this deal, with many fans citing poor financial management as the reason for doing so. Joe Mauer. Mauer might have had a Hall of Fame career, but it looked less and less likely as his career went on, averaging a still decent 28 doubles on 290 hitting over the course of his final contract. The problem is the Twins had far less success after agreeing to his extension, only amassing 1 playoff berth in 8 years and not even winning a single game. A key issue with the deal was that Mauer's value to the team dropped substantially when he transitioned from playing catcher to playing first base, practically moving from the most demanded position in the market to the most supplied position in the market. Their GM was fired just 1 year into the deal. Another GM who tried to navigate it was fired later on, and the owner has since been rumored to want to sell the struggling team. Miguel Cabrera. Cabrera was coming off back-to-back MVPs and even a Triple Crown when he signed an 8-year extension in 2014. But when the new deal finally began in 2016, it was the beginning of the end for his run of dominance. 2016 would ultimately be the last time he was named an All-Star. With an aging star quickly declining, accounting for roughly a quarter of the team's payroll, the Tigers rapidly fell down from grace, from a 90 and 72 mark in 2014 to a 47 and 114 record just 5 years later. Throughout the course of Cabrera's contract, the team has not earned a single playoff berth and has instead been undergoing a massive rebuild. Chris Davis. Davis averaged 40 home runs and 103 runs batted in from 2012 to 2015. So ownership decided they wanted to lock up Davis into his 30s. In 2016, he hit a still impressive 38 home runs, but in the 4 years after his dominant 4-year stretch, his batting average fell from 256 to 196. He hit an abysmal 179, in 2019 when he accounted for more than a quarter of the team's payroll. And with no resurgence in sight, the Orioles decided to stretch out his remaining salary, similar to the famous Bobby Bonilla deal. The GM who signed Davis to this contract was fired, and the Orioles have lost an average of 111 games in the last 3 full seasons, making them the worst performing team in recent MLB history. Of the 58 total seasons thus far, 8 contracts worth $1.5 billion, an average payroll accounted for of 16.5%, their average team winning percentage was .482. 13 of the 58 teams, 22%, made the playoffs. Only 3 of the 58 made the league championship series. 2 of the 58 made the World Series, including Wright's 38-game season for the Mets, and only one of the 58 won the World Series, the first year of Hayward's Cubs contract in 2016. 24 total seasons prior to the contracts, their average team winning percentage was .516. 9 of the 24 teams, 38% now, made the playoffs, and 5 of the 24, 21%, made the league championship series. Conclusion: recent long-term contracts in the MLB, ranging from 7 to 10 years in length, have crushed teams' collective performance and made it extremely difficult to contend for a championship. By locking up on average 16.5% of team payroll on one underperforming star player. The scary fact is that the 8 teams illustrated previously actually performed better in the 3 years prior to giving out their long-term contract than over the course of their long-term contracts. The costs of these poor investments are enormous. $1.5 billion in salary, 7 GMs fired, and 3 ownership sales. Why are long-term contracts even worse for MLB altogether? There are several examples of long-term contracts that have generated great success in the past, but the long-term contracts we have just analyzed are from a brand new category of player deals prevalent in the previous decade. These long-term contracts are massive in amount and always for at least 7 years in length. As proven, these types of contracts have demolished teams to the point they have no choice but to rebuild from the top down. These deals are not just bad for the teams that sign them, they are bad for the league as a whole. Teams performing poorly due to horrific long-term player agreements crush their local revenue, ticket sales and game earnings, sponsorship payments, and television deals. It also limits the revenue of nearby businesses who benefit from fans attending and watching their team's games. Less local revenue generated by teams means a lower overall fund for league revenue sharing, meaning these teams' poor contracts are directly limiting the small market teams from improving on their own. And since a handful of teams signing these bad contracts are from big markets, the net payees are even more burdened since they're still obligated to pay huge revenue sharing bills. In other words, the Los Angeles Angels not only lost out on significant revenue or return because of the poor Albert Pujols contract, they also had to give away 48% of any local revenue they did earn during this tenure. But it is fair to question whether or not the teams paying these miserable long-term contracts were really all that burdened at all. As it turns out, they were, because in the previous decade, the average revenue growth rate during the period of their long-term contracts was only 4.2%. You may be thinking this average growth rate would be higher had it not been for the smaller market teams in the list. However, the teams with the 4 shortest, least expensive contracts, Yankees, Orioles, Mets, and Cubs, and the teams with the 4 longest, most expensive contracts, Twins, Tigers, Angels, and Mariners, held the same exact average growth rate, 4.2%. This means that the teams with the shortest and long-term contracts suffered equally, and there was very little difference in growth rate depending on market size. So how were these teams burdened? Well, the average revenue growth rate of MLB during the previous decade was 7%, astoundingly a 48.4% higher growth rate, which would have been even higher had it not been for the 8 teams' such mediocre growth. It's true that teams who sign these new forms of long-term contracts are hurt in a big way financially when they don't succeed, and some are burdened even more when they have to pay revenue sharing on top of lost revenues. Likely the greatest detriment of all is that teams miss out on playoff revenue, the key ingredient in annual revenue growth, as demonstrated by the World Series champions, who averaged 16% growth from 2011 to 2019. The final judgment. Long-term contracts in Major League Baseball have demolished teams' winning potential, but organizations have kept agreeing to them because they are led by GMs trying to secure their jobs and because they bring the prospect of winning through star signings. Winning, and the idea of winning, sells, so short-sighted owners have signed off on these massive deals. As we've discovered through several examples, teams were actually better off before signing their long-term deals than after, and this repeated poor return on investment has cost GMs their jobs and teams over $1 billion. Their mistakes have not only hurt their teams, but the other teams throughout the league as well, since poor performing teams lead to less local revenue and in turn less money to the revenue sharing fund. Teams that are net payees still have to pay large revenue sharing bills on top of the lost revenue from the contract, and their burden is made even worse because they likely can't recuperate it in the form of playoff revenue. Revenue, and more of it, is so important for the success of teams in the league because it helps grow team fan bases through marketing investments, helps build franchises into winners through smart player signings, and helps grow the value of the league through dynasties. The third effect is of tremendous importance because MLB has had very little consistency with its champions, and the growth of the league has wavered off as a result. Dynasties undoubtedly grow the value of sports leagues, proven recently by the NFL with their Patriots, Steelers, and Giants glory, and proven recently by the NBA with their Spurs, Heat, and Warriors glory. Meanwhile, the MLB has not had a repeat champion since 2000, the Yankees. Here are how dynasties, formed through better investments and sky-high revenues, have shaped the growth of the three sports leagues together since the turn of the century. Major League Baseball needs teams to instead give out shorter-term contracts to free agents so organizations can recover quickly from mistakes, franchises can be more competitive more than they are burdened, and so dynasties can form to grow the league. The NFL and NBA do not have many burdened franchises because in those leagues it is far easier to recover from their mistakes since their long-term contracts are generally 3 or 4 years in length. As a result, competitive balance is even less of an issue, and fan bases are more inclined to enjoy their team's rebuilds rather than seek better opportunities. Fortunately, massive long-term contracts to free agents could be fading away, illustrated by the massive short-term contracts recently signed by Max Scherzer and Carlos Correa, who each agreed to receive $100 million plus over just 3 years.